Welcome to Wellness Spring, your oasis of health and vitality. Today, we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Ron Ehrlich, a true visionary in the realm of holistic health. Join us as Dr. Ron uncovers the pivotal role of public health messages and industry influence, including food and pharmaceuticals, in shaping our healthcare landscape. Together, we'll explore the challenges factors pose to maintaining holistic health and discover actionable steps individuals and organizations can take to navigate these complexities with resilience and clarity. Welcome, Ron, to Wellness Spring. It is so lovely to have you on the show.
Beverly, thank you so much for having me.
I'm just blown away when I read all your bio and everything else, because we have so much in common with health and wellness and nutrition and regenerative farming, and the list goes on. So could you please share with us how your journey into holistic health began and what some early influences from your upbringing, family, and surroundings that shaped your approach to health and wellness?
Yeah, well, very early on, I graduated from dental school 45 years ago, at a very, very young age, I should say. And I very quickly, very surprisingly, got into dealing with chronic musculoskeletal pain. I thought I'd be in dental pain area of toothaches and stuff, but I rather surprisingly found myself also having an impact on a few patients with their headaches, their normal tension headaches. And that led me to a period of about 2 or 3 years of exploring what was going on, what the connection was between jaw clenching and chronic pain. And in 1983, it led me to a model of healthcare that I've pursued ever since. And that model basically was the 5 stressor model that I've used professionally and personally and have written about in my book. And that is to say, stress is how you define stress is anything that compromises your immune system or promotes chronic inflammation. And so I define 5 stressors: emotional, environmental, postural, nutritional, and dental stress. And that's led me into an interest in each of those 5 areas. Obviously, my focus clinically, professionally, at the coalface, if you like, was dental. So that set me on a journey of discovery where I realized this wasn't just a model for treating people with chronic musculoskeletal pain, but also a good model for treating people with any health condition or trying to keep healthy. So I've kind of then morphed into a model where I see life as a balancing beam. And on one side of the beam, it's to identify and minimize as many of those 5 stressors as possible. And on the other side of the balancing beam is to build resilience by focusing on 5 pillars of health: sleep, breathe, nourish, move, and think. And the balancing beam, if you like, pivots on our genes and how our genes express themselves, the wonderful and empowering science of epigenetics. We are not a victim to our genes. So that's been my professional journey. And well, you probably realize this yourself, that the more you learn about health, the more you realize you don't know. And I find that rather exciting and empowering. Influences on my life have been, well, there was a chiropractor, Dr. George Goodhart, who gave me that model in 1983 in a workshop I did in America, that 5 stressor model. Dr. Janet Travell, who is a physician who used to be President Kennedy and President Johnson's doctor in the White House. I spent some time with her. I did a workshop with her for about a week in 1989 when she was 92 years old. And she said, if you listen to your patients, and you ask them the right questions and you listen with an open mind, then often they'll not only tell you what's wrong with them, but they'll often tell you how to fix it. And then also, you know, another great influence has been Dr. Bruce Lipton, who's talked about the epigenetics, the biology of belief. And if thoughts are things called neurotransmitters that can attach onto cell membranes and cause themselves to express themselves in some way, then so can nutrients and so can toxins. So he was another great influence. And then the world of regenerative agriculture and holistic land management via Alan Savory and others have been a great source of inspiration to me over the years.
Wow, you covered a lot then. I'm a big fan of Dr. Bruce Lipton, and pre-COVID, I was arranging to have him, Nassim Haramein, and Dr. Joan, a few others come for a conference in Monaco, because I used to organize holistic conference. And you mentioned his book, The Biology of Belief, and it's incredible, you know, as you said, the more you delve into it, the more you find out. And you mentioned some amazing people as well. And what about your family, though? Because I know you co-founded your Sydney Holistic Healthcare dental practice, and your brother's there, now your nephew.
Yes.
How did that start?
Well, that started with my brother and I were in separate practices in the city up until about 1981. He was across the road from me, and we were in tiny little practices. And when I got involved in this pain treatment, we decided to merge our practices together. And in 1983, began a journey on the holistic dental front. Firstly, exploring the controversial issues of dental mercury amalgam. I had graduated from Sydney University, and I also believed, like every graduate in dental school, that mercury was locked into the fillings and it was perfectly safe and there was no problem. And several practitioners that weren't dentists were encouraging me to look beyond the dental literature. And so we then in 1983 or 4 stopped using dental amalgam. So I've been very lucky. My brother has been a great source of support for me. I always felt that if I could talk my brother is a lot more conservative in his approach. And I always felt that if I could convince him of something professionally, then it was probably a good idea. And to his credit, and perhaps mine, I could convince him probably 90% of the time. Then about 30 years ago, we were joined by Dr. Craig Wilson, who just was the perfect balance between Josh and myself. And he also contributed greatly to that process. Then about 15 or so years ago, Dr. Yin Teo joined the practice and brought a whole new level of skills. And 10 years ago, we were really excited to have Josh's son, my nephew, who is like a son to me, Dr. Lewis Ehrlich, join us. And quite frankly, they have taken it to another level. And I'm really proud of where particularly Dr. Lewis, Dr. Craig and Dr. Yin Teo have taken the practice. So yeah, they've been huge supports and huge influences on me. And I've been a very, very lucky person in my life. My family, be it my parents, my brother, my wife, my children, and more recently my grandchildren, have been a tremendous source of support and inspiration to me. So I'm a very, very fortunate person. I'm aware of the power of gratitude, and I express it regularly and passionately as well.
That's wonderful. And I've experienced treatment with your lovely nephew, Lewis, and also Emily, the dental hygienist. And for the listeners, I can highly recommend the whole experience because the staff are so welcoming. They're all highly professional, and just the holistic approach, you know, asking you so many questions about your background, your lifestyle, and so forth. And for the listeners, Dr. Ron actually inspired me when I listened to him at a chat about 30 odd years ago. in North Sydney with Sandy Spears and the Holistic Business Centre, and you mentioned about the amalgam. And growing up in Wales, in the UK, my mouth, they said, oh, your enamel's not good. My mouth was just full of amalgam fillings of all sizes. And I was very faithful to my dentist at the time, so I went to him to have them all taken out. Can you tell us more? Because I know you're passionate about amalgam and the harmful effects of it.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one. And honestly, when I graduated, I just believed it was locked in and it was harmless. And if any did escape, it was the harmless, in inverted commas, inorganic form of mercury. And I didn't want to believe it. So as I said, in 1983, I was encouraged to read beyond the dental journals into environmental journals and other journals in science. And I had 3 samples of mercury fillings that I'd removed from a patient, and I knew from their records that they were 5, 7, 10 years old. And when they went in, there was 50% mercury, and the other 50% is silver, tin, zinc, and copper. So when I sent them off for analysis, they came back and some were 37%, some were 40, 42%. So mercury had escaped. Then the next question is, how significant is that? And of course, the answer is no, it's okay, it does escape. They'll admit that now, but it's the inorganic form. Well, the problem with the inorganic form is that if it comes into contact with microbes, of which there are a few in the mouth and the gut, then it goes through a methylation process which converts inorganic mercury into organic mercury, and that organic mercury can displace sulfhydryl groups from important compounds in the body like enzymes, hormones, DNA, a whole range of things. So I think possibly the most telling thing about dental mercury amalgam is, and this is what you can always ask your dentist who may dismiss this, you can say, okay, you think it's safe. When you have a little bit left over, that you've used on, you've used some on me, but there's a little bit left over. What do you do with the little bit that's left over, the scrap? Because I know the answer to that question. It is illegal by law for a dentist to dispose of dental mercury amalgam into the garbage, the toilet, or down the sink. That is illegal. But according to the NHMRC and the ADA and the health authorities, the only safe place to store this toxic material is in the human body. And if that makes sense to you, then you've got a bit of an insight into some of the other public health messages that may not have our health as their highest priority. So I think the dental mercury one was a really interesting one. We always had a position that there were 2 issues. One, should we still be using the material? In our opinion, the answer was definitely no. It should have been withdrawn in the mid-80s, and it is slowly happening, but we are in 2024 now. So do we use the material? No, and we stopped using it in about 1985. The second issue is, should everybody have every amalgam out? And my answer to that is no, you should proceed very cautiously, because you can be exposed to a lot of mercury if the filling is removed carelessly without adequate protection to you and the dentist. And you also need to be careful in disrupting the tooth and irritating the tooth unnecessarily. So this is a really complex issue. I mean, one of the things I'm really proud of at the Sydney Holistic Dental Centre is that we are a patient-centred practice. And people often go, well, what does that mean? And I mean, it's obvious, but what are the alternatives? Well, you could be a symptom-based practice, which means you just fix things that go wrong. You could be a practitioner-centred practice, and we've all been to those. A lot of medical specialists live in a practitioner-centred practice where we are so honoured to be in their presence. We should just be grateful to be listening to the wisdom of this practitioner. That's a practitioner-centred practice. And a financial-centred practice is one where, they're trying to generate as much fees as possible. And there's nothing wrong with being paid properly in a profession. I'm not saying that, but if that's the driving force for how you interact with patients, I think that's a real serious problem. We always had a very simple rule, and that was, if my wife, my daughter, my mother was sitting in the chair, what would I say to them, knowing what I know? And that is a patient-centered approach.
Wow, that's amazing. And I wish all dentists were the same as you and all professions, because I think what you covered there is, so important to every aspect of life, whatever business you're in, whatever tradesperson or health profession you're with. And you mentioned the role of public health messages, as well as and I know you're passionate about the influence of the industries like food and pharmaceuticals in shaping our healthcare system. How do these factors contribute to the challenges we face in maintaining holistic health? And what steps can individuals and organizations take to navigate these complexities?
What a great question. And, look, I think we live in a world of evidence-based medicine, right? I mean, that's what we're told all the time. Everything has to be evidence-based. Well, let's look at the evidence, because over the last 40 years, we have an epidemic of preventable chronic degenerative diseases that have been getting worse. Diabetes has gone through the roof. Cardiovascular disease is still the #1 killer globally. Cancer #2. Prescription medication taken as prescribed is the 3rd biggest killer in our society. Autoimmune conditions, 30 years ago there were 60, that is the body attacking itself. Now there are over 100. Mental health, 1 in 4 Australians have a mental health problem. 1 in 6 are on antidepressants. So if the evidence is anything to go by, and we are reminded that it should all be evidence-based, then you would have to say that there has been a serious public health problem. And that serious public health problem has, I believe, come about largely because since 1980, since a deregulated market, a market-driven economy, where shareholder supremacy trumps everything, and I use that word purposefully, where a shareholder supremacy trumps everything, including public health, then the role of the chemical, food, and pharmaceutical industry, and to that I would now add the media industries. I don't like to call them news services. I don't believe we have many news services anymore. We have many media outlets, and we call them newspapers. We call them news stations, but essentially they are media outlets. This is what is influencing public health policy. So this is, good health may make sense, but it doesn't make dollars. And when you have an industry like the pharmaceutical industry, which is now valued at, it has revenue of US $1.5 trillion a year. That's US $1.5 trillion a year. That's something like almost 2.5 or 2.7 trillion Australian dollars a year, the pharmaceutical industry. That doesn't happen if there is good health in the community. So paradoxically, our healthcare system is actually a chronic disease management system and not really well focused on public health. And I think part of the problem is that there are 2 words, if you like, that I think summarize why we have this problem. One is ignorance and the other is overwhelm. And, I know lots of doctors who work in practices where they have a 10 or 15-minute appointment and a prescription will result. I know a lot of integrative doctors who spend an hour or more with their patients, whatever. And I know both of them have one thing in common: they want the best for their patients. But the problem is there is such overwhelm of ill health and a bombardment of supposedly evidence-based medicine. But as one of the most cited academics in healthcare or in medicine, in science globally, John Ioannidis from Stanford University, he's been cited about 200,000 times in his articles, says evidence-based medicine is dead. What we have is evidence-based marketing. I think this is a story, because of overwhelm, that is very easy to miss as a health practitioner, as a patient. But once you hear it, it's very difficult to ignore. And so I think this is part of the problem we find ourselves in today.
I totally agree with you, and I'm horrified at all the misconceptions, the confusions, and the way people have been misled by the marketing. Like you say, we're run by the economy, and it's all about how much money's in it and who's behind the money. And in your book, you give some great examples about Pepsi, for example, and the do you want to explain about that, how sugar was advertised as being poison, and then next year it's not?
Yeah, well, that is a whole story about some of the big public health messages that we hear that, like, for example, the demonization of fat. Fat makes you fat. Well, that rolls off the tongue very easily, and it seems to make sense if you didn't think about it. But since we have demonized fat, obesity has gone through the roof, and so has diabetes. So, the demonization of fat meant that we ended up with a whole lot more sugar, or versions of sugar. There are many different versions of sugar in our foods. And when you look at the sponsors of some of the biggest professional organizations in the world, it is really alarming. I mean, the names that keep coming up sponsoring the American Dietitians Association or the Australian Dietitians Associations of people like Nestle, Campbell's Food, Unilever, the makers of Ben & Jerry's ice cream and Flora margarine, or it could be the Grains and Legumes Council or the Dairy Council. So there's a huge amount of corporate support for getting out public health messages for the good of, leave that word blank. Is it for the shareholder or is it for the public? Well, these companies have a fiduciary duty to provide good returns for their shareholders. So the one thing, and the same is true of pharmaceutical industry. I mean, the ultimate goal in the pharmaceutical industry, and we've probably just lived through the greatest business model in human history, the COVID pandemic. The best business model is to identify, to diagnose as many people in the population as possible as having an illness, which then needs to be managed, preferably for a lifetime. And that is a great economic model. It's just not a very good health model. The problem is that, there is a conflict of interest. And so where do we go from there as a public? I think we do have to come back to basics. We do have to come back to a common understanding of what got us to where we are in an evolutionary sense. When we parted with the chimps and gorillas 6 million years ago, our brains were about 400 cc in size. Then Homo erectus came along and it was about 700 or 1,000 cc's. And by the time we got to Homo sapiens, we were about 1,400 or 1,500 cc's. So the question is, how did our brains grow? And the answer is, we learnt to harness fire, we learnt to cook meats and extract nutrients, which provided us with the basis for our brains to grow. And that had a significant impact on our journey. So, that's one thing. Did we have lots of sugar? Well, if we found a tree with honey, with a beehive in it, my God, we would gorge ourselves. Of course we would. But we wouldn't have access to that 24/7 all year round. So we just need to go back and think about, how did we evolve And listen, thank God we live in, with the safety net of modern medicine. I don't want to, trivialize that. I've been the recipient of that, and it's had a huge impact on my life. It saved members of my family's lives. So I am eternally grateful to modern medicine for the miracles of modern medicine. But it's the way we approach health and preventable chronic diseases, which is where the problem really lies. So, I think we need to be aware of that. I think that's a story that's easy to miss, but difficult to ignore once you hear it. I think Beverly, ignorance is a wonderful thing. I practice it regularly. I practice ignorance regularly. It's why I have my own podcast. Every week I get to ask people who know much more than I do questions, and they answer them. And I learn a lot from it. And so that's great. But if you combine ignorance with ego, arrogance, and hubris, and even worse, if that ego then informs public health policy, then we have, based on the evidence we have available to us today, an epidemic in preventable diseases.
Yes. Oh my God, it's so scary and it's horrendous. And I think because we live in a fast-paced world, people have become masters at being busy, and they don't have time to sit down and think. And when I was growing up, in my era, we seen doctors as gods. And as Bruce Lipton would say, if you're sick and you go to the doctors, 90% of your illness has disappeared. You've healed yourself by the time you get to the doctors. They're so rapid, you think they're going to heal you, so they do. And now people, I've recently, and I totally agree with you about modern medicine being a wonderful thing, and we need it for baseline tests and evidence. And then it's up to you how you move forward, but it's good to have informed choices. And I was horrified when I went to the doctors recently to get, basic checks. And I asked for a vitamin D test, and they said, well, things have changed in Australia now, and if you've had one, you can only have one in your lifetime here for free. Otherwise, it's $400. And I went, what? That's crazy, because having lived in France for 15 years, we used to get free twice a year tests, because vitamin D is a hormone, as you know, and so important for so many areas of our life, like our brain and every system in our body probably is affected by vitamin D. And he just said to me, well, it's not that bad. He said, you have your test. If it's low, you take 2 tablets for life. And if it's normal, you just take 1. And I said to him, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. I believe, sometimes you need supplements and other times you don't, and you need to monitor it. So, and as you say, carry on. I was going to say
go on.
I was going to say in your book, you mention about doctors are overworked, overwhelmed, and they just accept whatever prescriptions. Take this is the wonder drug, and it's all sounds amazing. Oh, we've got this new disease, high cholesterol, this, that, or the other, and they just take it and prescribe it.
Yes, well, that's what I mean about ignorance combined with ego and arrogance and hubris. Because, I think I totally get the fact that if you're, as a doctor, you want certainty, because people are coming in with their health problems and you want to be as certain as you can. So that's fine. I totally get that. And I believe that doctors should be curious and skeptical. I totally get that too. My challenge to doctors is this: at what point in your medical education does that skepticism and curiosity kick in? Does it kick in after third-year medicine, where you started to study pharmacology and pathology and learnt how beautifully it was to be able to identify a disease and have a surgery or a pharmaceutical to treat that disease? Or should your curiosity go back maybe a year or 2 earlier than that to biochemistry, physiology, and learn why that disease actually occurred in the first place, and learn how to restore the body's natural ability to heal itself. So this is very much about ignorance, ego, arrogance, and hubris. And I totally get why there should be curiosity, there should be skepticism and curiosity. But unfortunately, too many in the medical profession are skeptical of the basics, like biochemistry, and vitamin D is a classic example. If you go through the biochemical pathways we all learnt in first or second year dental school, medical school, or whatever, we know that vitamin D is critically important. And here's another public health message that has caused far more problems than it's fixed, and that is to stay out of the sun. Not only did we demonize fats, not only did we demonize saturated animal fats that we've had a relationship with for millions of years and that happen to make up most of our cell membranes and our brain, somehow we've demonized that. We've demonized cholesterol, which is essential for every hormone that regulates us in the body. We've demonized that. But we've also demonized sunshine, which is the greatest source of vitamin D there is, with all sorts of other health benefits, about being out in nature, about connecting with nature, physiologically, biochemically, psychologically, so many benefits to being out in the sun. But I go down to the beach, I go down with my grandchildren, and thankfully we haven't swallowed, is it the red pill or the blue pill from the Matrix? I don't know. I've always get those two confused. But anyway, I see young people, young children there with rash tops from head to toe, covered in a hat with zinc cream plastered all over them. And I'm really pleased to see my young grandchildren running around almost naked and bathing in the sunshine, not in the middle of the day, not getting sunburnt, but early in the morning, lots of sunshine, lots of vitamin D, lots of connecting with the earth and nature, lots of good health to follow. So, there's another example of ignorance. The government congratulated itself for saving $150 million a year by scrapping vitamin D testing, and in the process probably added $1 billion or $2 billion onto their health budget because of the problems. We talk about ICU, intensive care units. There was a great study out of the Journal of Immunology, which showed that 70% of people who are admitted to ICU are deficient in vitamin D. And it is a pandemic around the world. Vitamin D deficiency is a pandemic. And as you rightly pointed out, Beverly, essential for every aspect of health, and anti-cancer, anti-cardiovascular disease, mental health, all sorts of breast cancer, colon cancer, liver cancer. There's certainly an impact on skin cancer, but all-cause mortality. Do the studies and have a look, or read the studies. Studies are being done.
Exactly. And it's so important, as you said, to be in nature and connect and have fun, just be free. It's absolutely crazy. Yeah, when you were talking about the zinc, it took me back to my sailing days where we'd be plastered in bright zinc colored and so forth. Anyway, I really want to ask you go back to a bit of dentist work. What is the significance of oral diseases, and why it is the black hole of healthcare?
Well, it's interesting because that's great. That's another great question, Beverly. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, it's so interesting. World Health Organization, which I have to have some problems with, but they recently did a global oral health report. And I should preface this by saying that the common denominator in all diseases, physical and mental disease, is chronic inflammation, right? So let's just park that aside for a moment. So they did a study on oral health in the global setting, and they looked at malignant cancers, for example. Apparently, there are about 100 million malignant cancer cases in the world globally. They looked at diabetes, about 450 million cases of diabetes globally. Cardiovascular disease, the biggest killer, 550 million people globally with cardiovascular disease. Mental health, we hear a lot about mental health. And, you know, as I think I said, 1 in 4 Australians have a mental health problem. 1 in 6 are on antidepressants. There are 1 billion people, just under 1 billion people diagnosed with mental illness globally. Now, when we get to oral diseases, they estimate 3.5 billion people globally have oral diseases. And the most common source of chronic inflammation, remember, that is, we're talking here about tooth decay and gum disease, which leads to chronic inflammation, which in turn impacts on every other disease. And I would estimate that 3.5 billion people is a gross underestimation, because half the population don't go to the dentist half the population haven't been to the dentist in the last 2 years. So 3.5 billion people would be a underestimation. And the other important thing to remember about oral diseases, tooth decay and gum disease, and this still blows me away after 45 years of clinical practice, the vast majority of oral diseases have no pain associated with them. So we had a patient in recently who came in with stage 4 cancer, and the doctor who referred them, quite rightly, for a comprehensive oral exam, which I think is a really important thing, a comprehensive oral exam, was concerned about a tooth that had a root canal treatment in it. And when we did a 3D scan and looked at every tooth and every which way that you could, it turned out that on the right-hand side of her mouth, the root canal was on one side. It looked fine clinically. We could talk a lot about that. But the other side of the mouth had advanced periodontal and infection and tooth infection at the tip of the root that must have been there for at least 5 or 6 years. She'd been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer 3 or 4 years earlier. And I said to her, was this side of the mouth ever painful? And she said, no, not really. Sometimes when I bite, it's a little bit tender, but it's never been a problem. And when we took a 3D X-ray, the bone, there was almost complete bone loss around one tooth and infection around 2 or 3 others that had at least been there for the last 5 or 6 years. So, you know, there is a case of somebody that's gone through a huge amount of treatment and diagnosis through some of the top people in Australia, no doubt, but ideally should have had a comprehensive oral exam to eliminate the most common disease known to man, woman, or child, and that is tooth decay and gum disease, with implications on every other disease because of the link of chronic inflammation.
Yeah, I know. I've been back and forth dentists all my life with crowded teeth, impacted teeth, overlapping teeth. And because you're a breathing instructor as well, I did some training with Patrick McEwen from the Boteco method, and he's, you know, the authority on nasal breathing. And we've been through a pandemic where everybody could have learned to functionally breathe, because as you breathe, then it stimulates the nitric oxygen, sterilize your air and so forth. And when you're mouth breathing, you're breathing in all the gunk, and that can add to, you know, infections as well. But my mum had periodontal disease, and she chose to have all her teeth out, and then she had leukemia. And I actually got diagnosed 16 years ago with thyroid and ovary cancer, but I healed it myself. But I've had for 20 years gum disease on and off, but my gums are shrinking. So just listening to you talking, because I've been fanatical about cleaning my teeth and seeing dentists every 6 months, and you know, it's very hard. And then you see other people, and I know lots of people that don't even bother going to the dentist. And yeah, I think people ignore the fact, and it's like, well, when they come to see me, you got all these other diseases, don't you go to the dentist? You know, this is where it starts. You know.
Well, this is why I do refer to the oral cavity as the black hole of healthcare. And,
Yeah.
I know, it's an obvious one, but here's why. I mean, doctors and health practitioners, allied health practitioners, will do their oral health assessment on their patient. Well, they may do nothing at all. They may not even ask them a question, but the one question they might ask them is, have you been to the dentist lately? And they will say yes or no. And if they've said yes, the doctor or practitioner will say, did anything show up? And the patient will say no. And thereby, the doctor has done an oral health assessment through those 2 or 3 questions. Remember, 95% of oral diseases have no pain associated with them. So that's the medical profession, how they approach it. The dental profession, look, dentistry is such an intense profession, and we are focused on minutiae. And what I mean by that is the human hair is 50 to 70 microns thick, right? Use that as a reference point. The human hair is 50 to 70 microns thick. A dentist assess the join between a filling and a tooth, or between a crown and a tooth, on the basis of about 20 microns. So if the gap between the filling and the tooth, or the crown and the tooth, is more than 20 microns, then you have got leakage in that filling, and more than likely decay will start to percolate underneath it. So we are, and also we're dealing with a very stressful situation. We're dealing with the person's most sensitive part of the body, the mouth, while they're awake, while they're trying to breathe and swallow, doing dental work that requires incredible technique, sensitivity, and trying to stay calm through it all. So it's really easy for dentists to get so focused on what they do that it's easy to forget that there's a mouth attached, there's a human body attached to the mouth that you're working on. So it's a kind of a black hole there, and we need to take a step back and get into the habit of doing a comprehensive oral exam. I mean, if you're in perfect health, you've never had a filling, you're in your 40s or 50s and you're in perfect health and you've got all 32 of your teeth, you've never had a filling, your gums don't bleed when you brush and floss, everything's perfect. Hey, good on you. Well done you. That's less of a problem. They're not really the people we're talking about. But unfortunately, not everybody falls into that category. And, so we do need to take a comprehensive oral exam seriously in healthcare.
Agree. And I know in your Unstress podcast, you always ask your guests, what's the greatest challenge to us as individuals on our health journey through life? Could you please tell us your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we kind of covered it a little bit, because I do think that ignorance is one thing, and as I said, I'm practicing ignorance regularly, so I'm not holding myself up to be an authority. But I think there's something about keeping an open mind and remembering how the human body works. Remembering that it's a whole body we're talking about in a whole world, and we're all connected, we're all affected. So that is really important. Ignorance is one thing and overwhelm is another. Doctors are overwhelmed. Professionals are overwhelmed, healthcare professionals. We as the public, because we're all patients as well, everybody is constantly overwhelmed, and there's something about distracting us from the simple things. I mean, a very frequent thing that I like to remind people of is that as the world we live in becomes increasingly more complicated, the solutions to staying healthy are remarkably simple, cheap, accessible, sustainable, and most importantly, effective. So I think keeping it simple, keeping an open mind, and keeping in touch with what we have, with nature, with our journey through time, I think they're really the biggest challenges we have.
Right. And you've mentioned a couple of times now your 5 pillars of health and wellness. Do you want to go into that a bit more?
Sure. Well, look, As I said, the balancing beam of 5 stressors: emotional, environmental, postural, nutritional, and dental stress that promote chronic inflammation and reduce immune function. But the 5 pillars are sleep, breathe, nourish, move, and think. And I would say, you've already mentioned the importance of breathing. I mean, this is not I'm not giving too much away here, Beverly. The secret to living a long life is to keep breathing for as long as you can. But there is a big difference between just breathing and staying alive and breathing well and being healthy. So there is a big difference between just breathing, and you mentioned mouth breathing and nasal breathing, big difference there. So breathing and sleeping are foundational. Nourish is a whole story on its own, but I think if we look into an ancestral diet, we get a pretty good idea of what we should be eating. Movement, I say movement rather than join a gym and do workouts. We just need to get out and move regularly and think. While we may not have control over events or people in our lives, what we do have control about is how we think about it. And I have been really focusing in these last 2 years, particularly on mindset. My focus is very much on looking at our daily challenges, personal and professional, the mindset with which we approach those challenges. Is it a growth mindset or is it a threat, survive mindset? That's important. And how do we recover each and every day? And that's where the 5 pillars come in. So that's kind of the model that I would work on. But those 5 pillars: sleep, breathe, foundational; nourish, move, and think, absolutely critical.
Absolutely critical. You also run workplace programs. And I know during the pandemic, 2 of my nieces, one of them was studying to be a teacher, or she was at the time. And when she had to do placements, there was such a high number of teachers off sick. And she's still experiencing that now. She's qualified. She goes to schools and there's so many off sick. And the other one was just 25, and she was working for a branding and marketing multi-dollar company. And her manager was taking a full day off on a Friday while the rest were doing 80 plus hours a week. She had no support, and she was like pushed up the ladder with nothing. Fortunately, she's left that job now because there was no support. But can you tell us a bit about your workshop program and mainly how it focuses on transforming the collective health of teams and organizations, and maybe some insights that you could share on how individual health within a workplace setting can lead to a broader positive impact?
Yeah, well, having been in healthcare for all this time, what I've come to realize is it's a paradox. And the paradox is good health, as I've said, may make sense, but it doesn't make dollars. So while the healthcare system we have is a great economic model, it's not a very good health model. What's changed, not just in my professional life, but in the legislation, is in October 2022 in New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland, and internationally through an ISO standard, ISO 45003, psychosocial risk, safety and risk in the workplace is now legislated. It is the responsibility of not only boards, not only CEOs, not only heads of HR or people and culture, and not only managers, it is to manage and mitigate, minimize psychosocial risk and encourage well-being for their workforce. So that's now not just a nice to have, it's a must have. And there are literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars of fines being issued. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. So workplace well-being is where I believe we will see change globally in healthcare. Why? Because there is a confluence of interest. Deloitte did a study in 2023, Deloitte's UK did a study which showed for every £1 or dollar a company spends on well-being, there is a $5 or £5.60 return. So unlike in healthcare, where good health may make sense, but it doesn't make dollars, in the workplace, not only does good health make sense, but it also makes dollars. And burnout and stress is a major problem in the workplace. And if you think it's just the workplace, get this, I did a podcast recently on medical burnout. 44% of doctors and 60% of nurses in Australia suffer from burnout. So that's a sobering statistic. So I think where we should be focusing on is the workplace, and the way to reduce stress in the workplace is to have an engaged workforce. And how do we have an engaged workforce? We have an engaged workforce by people having regular, that means weekly, meaningful conversations with their team. And that doesn't just mean at the water cooler, oh, how was your weekend? Oh, yeah, great. Will I see you this? No, it's to sit down only for 5 or 10 minutes every week and say, how has your week been? How is it? Have you faced any problems? Do you have any suggestions for making the workplace better? Thank you for your input. Move on. And that level of engagement and involvement can make a big difference. So I think the workplace is a really interesting area to be involved. I'm very excited about focusing on it because there is a confluence of interest and there's a great return on investment. And our focus is on the daily challenges, the mindset, and the recovery. And the recovery is embedded in the 5 stress or 5 pillar model, but the mindset is focused on positive intelligence, looking at the saboteurs which go on in our brains, sabotaging us every day. It's about giving a language and structure to the voice that goes on in our head each and every day, and having our minds work for us instead of against us. Our mind can be our best friend or our worst enemy.
Yeah, I can relate to that, as I teach people mindset as well, and the disempowering beliefs and about our egos and so forth. And I'm a former nurse, and I know lots of nurses here and doctors, and I can totally empathize with them because they're still overworked, overwhelmed, and burn out. Like, one friend is at the Royal Randwick, and she's in charge of drug and alcohol, and 6 of her colleagues are off sick, you know, and she has to cover that hospital and others as a nurse consultant. And the pressure, you're not getting it from the top, you're not getting the support, and, you know, and the list goes on.
Well, there's a difference between being stressed and being burnt out. The features of being burnt out are that you are disengaged, that you feel what you're doing is ineffective, and that you are exhausted. So they're the 3: D-I-E, disengaged, ineffective, and exhaused.
Die.
Well, hopefully
I like
not.
that anagram. Yes, and I always ask my guests, if there was one thing you could do to change the world, what would that be?
I think it would be to encourage us to re-engage locally with our communities. I think the irony of modern life is that we are connected with the whole world. We could have literally thousands or even millions of friends on Facebook and on social media, but we're not engaged with the person sitting next to us. We don't know who our neighbours are. We should be coming back into the village. I mean, I think globalization has some great benefits, but I do believe that if we just focused back on putting our feet back on the ground, literally and metaphorically, and connecting with each other and with nature, that would make a huge difference to us as a global population, both for the health of people and the planet, because the two are inseparable.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I know when we were traveling in Italy, in Genoa, there's the oldest living community, because they still have social gatherings and community centres, and, you know, exactly what you're saying. They have that connection. So I think this was an amazing podcast, and I'm sure the listeners will think the same. You've covered so many amazing health tips and stuff that we should be looking out for. And for the listeners, you can contact Dr. Ron for coaching, and whether it's individually or at the work, at Dr. Ron Ehrlich, EHRILlich.com, or I believe you're only seeing in your dental practice old clients, not taking on any new.
I've actually stepped away from the clinical side of things now, and I'm just focusing on the workplace well-being, executive and health coaching. So no, but the team, as I said, the team at the Sydney Holistic Dental Centre have taken it to another level anyway. So you would be in a very good patient-centered hands there in that practice.
Yes, so just reach out to them at shdc.com.au, and you can also get Ron's book on his website. And is there anything you'd like to share before we say goodbye?
No, I think you've covered it very well. Thank you for having me, Beverly.
Thank you for being on the show. You're amazing.